All right, everyone, I'm gonna open up the panel because as Elisa mentioned earlier, we're on a bit of a tight schedule. This is our final session and I guess one of our star or like something that brings added value is the GS4S project. We have this focus on what business can teach us when we're talking about these themes of skills and migration and the intersection of policies. And I think it follows up really well from the last panel and thinking about not from just simply a migration perspective, but about all the actors and stakeholders involved and how about individuals and workers potentially. And I think, I'll just start off right away with Sandra Lavenex and also Elisa mentioned are going to be presenting about mobility provisions and trade agreements. So Sandra, please.
Yes, thanks a lot. So we are following up on what Antonia Karzanika was presenting yesterday with regard to mobility linked to trading services in the World Trade Organization and the General Agreement on Trading Services. And we look specifically at these regional agreements that she was also mentioning that have developed since 1995. And more specifically in this project at EU trade agreements. It's a very specific form of labor mobility, a commercial exchange linked to trade. It is temporary. It can involve employment, but only as posted workers. So you retain your work contract at home and you are deployed to a destination country to work for a certain time. It is mainly highly skilled, as also Antonia said. The countries have not opened up for this mobility at low skill levels. And it is often linked to the presence of multinational corporations as well. But not only, we have also other forms of mobility that work outside multinational corporations, like the traditional posted workers that are called contractor service suppliers. We have the independent professionals. Yeah, and so we study this in this project, and today we want to introduce our database to you and also show a little bit what it's useful for, what can we study with this database, and Elisa will then present where we stand just now with the coding for the database. So the database has two parts because we look at EU trade agreements. EU trade agreements are particular because we have one part, the general part, that is common to all member states. The EU negotiates as one unitary actor. But then we have a second part, schedules or annexes, which are country specific, where the member states enter their specific conditions under which they facilitate this kind of labor mobility. So in the first part, the general treaty, we have 94 EU, EFTA, as well as UK trade agreements that we code. Between 1990 and 2021, it's already done, but we actually now are updating until 2024. And there are general mobility provisions. So there is a chapter on regulatory cooperation, and what Antonia was presenting yesterday is in this chapter. For example, speeding up procedures, increasing transparency for getting a visa, also reducing visa fees. This will be in this cooperation, which is sometimes provided for and sometimes not. So it's not in all trade agreements. Then also, fees limitation, facilitation of work, all these issues I was saying. And then we have specific mobility provisions that are tied to categories of persons. And in these trade categories, legal categories of persons, we have business visitors, independent professionals, intra-corporate transferees, corporate CSS, contractual service suppliers, but also trainees, which is a more flexible category that also can be at lower skill levels, and also installers, which sometimes follow on an investment, for example, for an IT supply. The installer can then come recurrently to maintain this installation, and this is also sometimes covered in these trade agreements. And the provisions by which this mobility is facilitated we count in total 15. It is the abolition of the economic needs test. So these people do not compete with other workers, EU, EFTA, or nationals for the job, but can directly enter. The abolition of quota, the duration of stay that can be expanded, also lowering the requirement for certain experience levels that are in the national law or skills. So, for example, in Germany, we find that, well, it's also international law, but that for IT professionals, for example, the language requirements have been facilitated, and this is sometimes also what we find that in schedules, requirement and so on. Yeah, so this is the general part, and then we have this specific part that is containing provisions at the national level of the member states, and Elisa will present this in a minute. Very briefly, what can we do with the database? So we can map the frequency of mobility provisions, also compare across EU and other trade agreements, or across the categories of persons that are covered by trade agreements. What we find from the EU trade agreements is that roughly 40% of them do have mobility provisions. And we see on the right-hand side that most of these provisions facilitate the mobility of intra-corporate transferees, so linked to multinational companies, but also these business visitors are quite frequent. Maybe an additional important information is intra-corporate transferees are covered for up to 5 years. So they come for up to 5 years. It's not just a short-term mobility. Business visitors is short-term, it's under 3 months, but it can be recurrent, right? They can come several times per year. Yeah, and you see the categories that are in orange, they are not linked to investment, they are not linked to companies doing business, but come as individuals. This is less frequently liberalized. What we can also do with the database is explain, and here I present joint work with Philipp Lutz, who is here, and Paula Hofmeier-Slotnick, who were working in a previous phase of this research. And here we look at what are the drivers of the mobility provision in trade agreements. And what we find, this is ongoing work, is that it's mainly economic factors. So economic globalization, more countries open economically, the more it has such mobility provisions. Also, the more countries trade with one another, the more we will have liberalization. In contrast, migration asymmetry or visa restrictions, which are two measures for the let's say potential or potential hesitation that we expect a country to have to ask for mobility with another country when this country fears that there will be, more immigration from this country. We see that this does not play a role. So countries are not more liberalizing less towards countries for which they impose visas or from which they receive more immigrants than they send. So they are not fearful of having more immigration via this kind of labor mobility. What we also find to be, however, statistically significant is path dependence. So there's a certain copy and paste phenomenon of these PTAs. Once you have one, you will do something similar in the next one. Okay, this is another way we can use it. And a third way we can use it is to evaluate the effects, right? What is the impact of these facilitations? And it's very hard to get at, because in most countries, you cannot single out statistically these posted migrants or independent professional migrants from other migrants that are present on the territory. The national statistics do not have a code to show them. There are visas, but even at the visas, it's too mixed. You cannot really get at it. But in Switzerland, since 2015, in the general population statistic, which is StatPop, the one that also Yvonne showed before, so it's an overall population statistic. Since 2015, we have a code that allows us to see whether a third country national is actually posted or not. And we have analyzed this in 2 papers that just were published this summer, and also acknowledge our GS4S project, because Mariana is also working on this. She's ill today, but she's also paid on the budget, and unfortunately she cannot be here today. But yeah, anyways, what we find is really very interesting. So we have this quota for third country nationals, as we were already told by several speakers. We have roughly 8,600 third country national visas per year. And this remains rather stable over the last decade, so it's always around this number. And then we looked into our population statistics, how many of these third country nationals, which need to be highly skilled according to our legislation, but this is just a side comment, how many of these are posted? And we find, this is this graph here, that actually it's between 30 and 40% of these third country nationals coming under the quota are posted workers. And this went a bit up in the year 2018 and went a bit down, but it's catching up again. And we want to update this with new data. So it's from 2014 to 2022, and the lower line is the posted workers, and the other one is the non-posted workers. So it's a significant share of our third country immigration is posted. And there are political reasons for that, because they are not visible. It's in the interest of our highly internationalized economy, which pays a lot and can do this kind of capital supply and IDD. Okay, and then we also looked whether trade agreements had an impact, whether we receive more workers from a country. Once there's a trade agreement, we don't find a significant effect yet. Maybe over time, especially because it's a guarantee that can be eventually enforced, but we are not sure. So no really effect of trade agreements, but once the countries have this in the law, it has a certain effect. And now I hand over to Elisa for the schedules, which are national provisions in the member states.
Yes, thank you. So now concerning the schedules, we find specific commitments concerning mobility in 61 European PTAs. So the structure of the database is the following: is the first entry being the schedule, then the country it applies to, followed by the sectors specified by the industry code, and then finally the categories of persons and the relevant coding of the requirements. So we have 31 variables, which you can see here in total. But we are also working on a subset of this database, which is specific to qualifications in the European Union. So this database is made up of 19 variables for which we find corresponding requirements, following entries in 17 European PTAs. Our code specifies whether a qualification is a requirement that is compulsory or is subject to exemptions. And since we are coding at the EU member state level, this adds up to a bit more of 200 entries. So as an illustration, I took some schedules of the European treaties. So for example, this one is a language requirement in Portugal. So this schedule grants exemption from nationality requirements when the person supplies services to a country where Portuguese is a national language. So we got a language. Then this is Croatia. So all people providing direct service to patients in healthcare must have a license. And this one is the last schedule I have. This is pretty interesting because all of these schedules applies to multiple European countries. And you can see here that there's a requirement for university degree as well as experience. So we also have a code specifying the number of years needed in these schedules. So this is a quick overview of what we have now. We can offer a quick preliminary analysis of qualification clauses per workers and sectors, globally tertiary degrees, as well as experience at the most frequent qualifications requirements, followed by licensing. And in terms of workers, contractual service suppliers, as well as business visitors, are the most frequent subjected qualification requirements. And it's also interesting to know that trainees have at least half of the tertiary degree requirements, so university degree, which makes sense because the training is often linked to their university degree. And when it comes to sectors, healthcare is definitely the most represented amongst all of them. As many sector-specific clauses compared to construction or IT. But the most populated category is still horizontal, so that means it applies to all sectors. And finally, I have a small sectoral breakdown of qualification clauses per country. So we can see that the countries most represented are France, Croatia, and Hungary. And as well as a bit Austria, we can see that more in the healthcare sector, with France, Austria, and Croatia being the most represented in terms of qualification requirements. And then ICT and construction, as expected, don't have as many qualification clauses. Although ICT, even if it has the fewer in absolute numbers, a lot of countries still have at least one requirement in that sector.
And just a conclusion, I think. Yeah, so it's an understudied venue for skilled labor, perhaps also with potential for partnerships that can be developed in a targeted way. We can assess liberalization across country sectors and types of regulation as well with this data. So far, our data from Switzerland suggests that the PTA itself has no effect on either the legislation or the flows. But these business migrants, as we call them, are a significant part of the migrant population. And we have a survey company, a company with survey with companies that has been coordinated by Aisha, that who will present first result, who shows as well that companies use intra-corporate transferees quite a lot, also as a way to address skill shortages. So yeah, there's a political interest behind these liberalizations. And with this, we went to the next presentation.
Thank you so much. The illustration is helpful also about how to use it. I think we're going to move from more of a data crunching now into a more theoretical exercise with my colleague here, Friedrich Poeschel. Who will introduce remember that he lost my
Thank you very much, Colleen. Actually, Colleen is a co-author of the paper, so I hope I meet her standards. Isa is a co-author, Tesla is a co-author, and Martin Roos, who's in Florence. So actually, this relates to something that we've been talking repeatedly about in here, but also during the coffee break. So the numbers are low, too low in the global skills partnerships that we know, and how to bring them up. So here the idea is a little bit like to be provocative, to unleash business dynamics in this context. Could that be a way of bringing up numbers and basically using the dynamics or also the self-interest? I mean, given the shortages, there might be self-interest of companies to really solve this problem, that the numbers are too low in this context. So the global skills partnerships that we know of so far are predominantly public-private partnerships. That, of course, has strengths and weaknesses. Strength could be is that you can gear it to a particular policy goal and so on. The weakness is currently that the employers are not as involved as we would hope them to be. It can be difficult to get them on board, or they once they are on board, they might not always stay on board. Because if the program is small and remains small, then the costs per person are high, and so that might not work out in the long run. So what can you do about it? Well, you can try to sort of leave it more to them. That they set up themselves, basically, problems that serve them well, and where they are happy to remain and sort of increase the numbers. And that could be then a way to scale up things. Of course, as I say this already, you see, oh, this could be very much driven by self-interest. So you also want to think about the regulation around this. To understand the potential, but also the risks of these setups that would be business to business, basically. We want to look at a few concrete examples. We look at some real world examples too, but none of them are like a perfect fit to study. And we use a simple SWOT analysis of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, which is used quite often in management context. But yeah, so this is basically a brainstorming exercise at a conceptual level. So one example that we looked at is joint ventures. So you have an employer in a destination country, let's say somewhere in Europe, and you have an employer in an origin country, let's say in Tunisia, and they found a joint venture to train people in Tunisia. Here on this side of the line, we are in Tunisia. The training happens in Tunisia, people are selected for it locally, and then of the graduates, some stay in Tunisia and work for the Tunisian employer, and some go to Europe and work for the European employer. So things like that happen. There's an example here from civil aviation. You do have joint ventures set up so that Airbus, for example, trains people in Brazil to fly Airbus aircraft, right? So things like that do happen, but there's no migration involved in that example. Okay, there's always something missing, so there's no perfect. The strength here, I can't go through all of it in the time that I have, but the strength is that, well, this could be quite flexible. So here the two employers just have to agree on what to do, what kind of training to have. And then they can really sort of gear that to their own needs, right? They likely also want the training to be good. I mean, we've heard about trainings that people are happy about, but perhaps have no impact also yesterday. So here the training is likely to be good because the people who decide about the training, they benefit from it, right? The better trained your new employees are, the better for you. The weaknesses include that, well, yeah, okay, if you have something like this running, who decides whether this is actually a global skills partnership? In the sense that governments go along and say, yes, this is a nice global skills partnership, and we give you visas for that. That might not happen, right? So without government involvement, how do you fix or how do you sort of secure this formal side of things? As in any joint venture, and there's lots of stories about that, you can have disagreements, right? Yeah, so that's a weakness potentially. An opportunity, and here IOM and ILO come into play, certainly, is that, or also national governments can come into play, that to decide whether or not something like this is a global skills partnership, you can set up structures that, if they are met, then it implies that it's recognized as a global skills partnership. And that could be, for example, for the joint venture, could be a template memorandum of understanding. That if you follow this template for the contract, then you have a very good chance of being recognized. A thread that I want to highlight is when we know that the employers, so think of rather large employers here from the destination country, they have deep pockets and so on, or can have deep pockets, and they want people. They could set up a shell company somewhere, and basically decide everything themselves, and use this officially a global skills partnership to recruit people for themselves, and there's no real local involvement. And then in that case, Tunisia doesn't gain much, right? That's a problem. So another example is similar to the first, but here we don't have an employer in Tunisia. We don't have an employer in the origin country. It's basically in-house. There's only the destination country employer owning the training center and running the still, you could have that some people stay after the training and only some people migrate. So that could be, of course, very convenient for many employers because they don't have to agree with anyone. They don't need a joint venture partner. They can run the show. They can tailor it very much to their own needs. But it is still here unclear if that could ever be a global skills partnership officially. And it is unclear how Tunisia gains. So to what extent do people actually stay after the training or perhaps return? And okay, I'll leave it at that. There's of course the threat also that it becomes a way of recruiting cheap labor, right? An example in the real world is the Dutch seafarers. So there is a kind of institution or what is it? It's a business in the Philippines training Filipinos to be captains of seafarers, basically of Dutch, right? So this is basically the Dutch association of Dutch companies setting this up in the Philippines to train people for themselves. We noted, and this relates to Sandra's topics, we noted that something like this for large corporations is already possible if you have, basically if you replace the trading center with just a subsidiary. If you're a multinational company and you have this presence abroad, you can just tell your presence abroad, train people locally, and then you can recruit them all for headquarters in Europe. So this might already be possible, and it might. So this could be good. It could be bad. Looking at the opportunities and the threats, but we are saying this could already be happening, and if it's a way to efficiently and properly regulated organize a global skills partnership, then perhaps it's underused. I want to briefly touch on another example where there are intermediaries. So here, okay, we have an employer again in the origin country, employer in the destination country, but they don't really get in touch to do anything. There are service providers here. Let's say for simplicity, there's a recruitment agency that also runs somehow or owns a training center. So let's think of this as one service provider in the origin country. So of course, the service provider could provide services to the local company too, as well as the company in Europe. They can sort of organize the training according to, say, demand from these employers, and they get paid for that, right? So in the real world, we find that quite often companies don't have a way around intermediaries because they don't have the contacts already abroad to set up a joint venture, or they have little cross-border business experience, but they need people. And so they end up working with intermediaries as a way to, well, these are specialized service providers, that's a strength. Also as a way to make sure they are on the books, they are in compliance with all the laws, because there's a lot of laws out there about this, and they don't want to get too much into the details. If they say, if they go for service providers, then they think, okay, they must know what they're doing, and they take the risk. If something turned out to be illegal, it should be them to take the blame. That's a bit the idea. So these are some of the strengths. The weaknesses are, well, first off, I guess we've all heard about scandals where intermediaries basically running a cheap labor and bad working conditions show. So that has to be somehow avoided. There has to be some sort of quality mobility industry. Also, the fees can be quite high that they charge. The quality is, well, it's not obvious, right? You don't know really what's happening in the training. So it could be that the training actually is just sort of a front, as there's not much quality training happening, because in the end, if you get your workers this way in a legal way, you're still happy. And of course, it's also not so clear how the origin country gains, because yes, okay, in theory, you can supply people from the same training to employers in the origin country. But I mean, these guys, they know that they can perhaps get much higher fees from companies in Europe. And so they end up supplying mainly to Europe or even exclusively. Here, a related example from the real world is that healthcare providers in Germany have started recruiting privately. So basically without going through any, trying to create business contacts in that sense across borders to recruit and also sometimes to train abroad for their needs, and then to basically and they do use intermediaries also in this context. But then there's an agency that's public. Okay, there's an agency that comes in and help you in this context with the paperwork. So it takes it can do some of the work of intermediaries for you, sort of instead of them, and it can make sure that you are sort of in compliance with the laws and with some ethical standards in this context. So it's a way to not sort of insist that recruitment be done through some public channel, but to facilitate private or business to business recruitment and give it a regulated frame, let's say. So the key findings are that these business to business setups are often very flexible and can be adapted to labor market needs. That makes them attractive. The problem is that it's never quite clear when they would be accepted as a global skills partnership, and you need to know this before you really start investing money and effort and time into such a thing. There could be many more other setups out there. We have only considered here a few, but we find in these few that there's a temptation to disregard the interests of the origin country. Although the training quality often might be high in business to business context. So what can we do about the origin country? Well, that's a bit of an Achilles heel of every global skills partnership. But one thing that I find interesting here is that if you have a real company in the origin country involved in a joint venture or something similar, then they are interested. They will follow their interest and insist that they also gain, and thereby the origin country will will have some of the trained people staying there. Intra-corporate transfers, I mentioned, it's already possible, and we don't know much about to what extent it is used. And as a point about smaller companies, they have to often turn to intermediaries. But I wanted to make another point about them that is here. They can in principle get together in consortia at a regional level to set up a business to business global skills partnership. Even if they're too small to do such a thing like by themselves, with regional partners, it could really make quite some sense, because there's also different needs involved, but still you know each other from sort of the local level. And together you get big enough and there's a trust basis. Otherwise, policy implications, yes, we in this context, we need somehow standards that define or decide whether it's a global skills partnership or not, and whether you will have the fast track visa. In this context, we need guidelines, and ILO and IOM have been putting out guidelines in the labor migration context. So some of them already apply here to make sure that this is actually a global skills partnership with triple win in the sense that we would like to see. In this context, international organizations and NGOs could play a role in monitoring also at the local level. There are NGOs that are very present at the local level and can sort of do this. And say for those companies that lack contacts abroad, there might be a role for the EU and for EU delegations to facilitate this. And finally, a bit the elephant in the room is recognition of qualifications. That is a huge issue that might decide about, whether you want to apply even. If employers think that, okay, if I don't see a way how the issue of recognition of qualifications will be resolved, then I don't even start trying to set such a thing up, because I will find out in 3 years' time that it's not recognized and I've wasted all my effort, basically. Okay, thank you very much.
So much for you, like, well represented the team. And then now if we could turn over to my Radboud colleague, Professor Saka-Helmhout, and also Dr. will be joining her and presenting their work.
Thank you very much. So much, Colleen. Colleagues, can you all hear me? Yes. Yeah. As Colleen introduced, I coordinate the fourth board, which is about the business perspective on ways of filling skill shortages and whether that can help other institutions, governments learn a thing or two about how it is done. We are going to today present our preliminary findings from a survey that was conducted in the spring of this year, running into, in fact, September. I think about the second round of the Dutch survey. We have, by the way, just to provide an update, completed the Dutch survey. So there were 4 countries involved. The Swiss team is represented here by Sandra, Mariana, Elisa, and we had also survey companies helping us out in Estonia, Germany, as well as the Netherlands. We have at the moment more or less 4,500 total responses, and a quarter of those are from the multinationals. So what I'm going to do together with Daniel is to go over the findings from the multinationals, and then I will hand over to our colleagues, partners from the same work with Arjen, who will step in for the difficult questions to focus on the SME findings. The MNE responses, we had several filter questions. So we're going to be focusing on the responses obtained from the international independent large companies. We also had subsidiaries of companies answering these questions as well. And when you discount the speeders and the straight liners, you're left with, at least for the context of this analysis, 771 responses. Okay, moving on to some of the descriptives before I hand over to the analysis, is that we do see multinationals facing acute shortages. No surprise there, probably. You can see 84% of them report experiencing moderate to high skill shortages. How are they addressing those? It's a mix, really, of technological, organizational, and cross-border strategies. And on top of the list, we see the reliance on automation or digitalization. And that suggests that they're less dependent on the scarce human capital, and creates a new skills demand that can reinforce migration and training policies. We also see that there is use of intra-corporate transfers and movement of people from both within the EU as well as beyond the borders of the EU. We said something about the importance of mobility schemes. And we have firms also making use of short contracts, about 16% indicate that, as well as partner for migration. But for me, I think the more creative response strategy is the very last one in the list, where we're talking about companies setting up, creating remote work contracts, hiring individuals that are not necessarily tied to a particular location. Now, these creative innovation or innovative strategies will not really deliver, will face limitations if we don't have strong policies to support them. And we do see multinationals pointing to things that could be improved, one of which is the recognition of qualifications, which my colleague Friedrich also mentioned just before this one. So if we can streamline processes where you are able to sort of solidify, recognize qualifications, provide work permits in a facilitated manner, they would definitely benefit. I think I also want to flag something that I want to revisit at the very end of the presentation, which is amazingly low participation rates in these non-EU promotions of skills and the partnerships of multinationals abroad, which is about 16%. So at this stage, Daniel, I'll hand over to you for the analysis and then come back after the findings.
Thanks very much. Oh, it's loud. Yeah, so we have a very interesting data set, that's clear. Just going back one step to something that Tesseltje mentioned in her very excellent keynote. That when we talk about migration, when we talk about skill shortages, it tends to be about government, their policies, and the migrants themselves. And perhaps outside of this room, sometimes also more regional ramifications of this. So how you have brain drain, for instance, impacting negatively one economy and another having brain gain. So to me, the interesting thing that we do is not just look at the business side, which is relatively new, but not just at what responses they have and the extent to which skill shortages exist, but also what helps, what works, what response is something that helps businesses solve this. And Madi had a very interesting, if you were there yesterday, a very interesting presentation about how automation might factor in there. And that's one of the elements that we have, but we have many more, and I's already mentioned some. So to the analysis, what works then, and how did we look at this? I won't exhaust every detail, but I'm more than happy to give you all the information that you might need. But what did we do? We basically looked at patterns towards successfully addressing business shortages. So what works, what doesn't, and we used what is called a Boolean analysis, or QCA, qualitative comparative analysis. Very interesting. Basically, you reduce everything to ones and zeros. So for instance, a business could be highly internationalized, or a business could be pursuing automation as a response. So that can be present, a 1, it can be not present, a 0. And then you start crossing out what doesn't matter and what matters, and how you still consistently get to this outcome. So in this very simple example here, we have 2 cases. We have many more, of course, and we have only 2 conditions, condition A and B, and outcome Y. Outcome Y could be, successfully addressing skill shortages. We see that between these 2 cases, condition A is always present, but condition B is only present in case 2. So let's say this is a pattern that happens throughout the data. That means that you can basically cross out condition B. Doesn't matter. This is the foundation of this type of analysis, but we still consistently get these patterns to the outcome. Why is this interesting? Because it shows combinations of responses, shows combinations of business characteristics, which you might not so easily get with another type of analysis. This is what that looks like. It's perhaps a little bit overwhelming, but trust me, it's very simple. We have 3 pathways here. So we have pathway 1, 2, and 3, and we have conditions. So these are the solutions. These are the ways in which businesses are able or not able to get to the outcome. When it's a black circle, it means this is present, this condition. So the first pathway are firms that are highly internationalized. A lot of their sales, more than 20% in our case, comes from outside of their domestic market. So this is either the firm itself or their parents, if they're they don't use labor-saving technologies, so they're not automated. They do intra-corporate transfers. So when it's crossed out, I forgot that part's rather important, means it's not present. And when it's blank, it doesn't matter. Basically, we have 3 patterns towards solving skill shortages here. Pattern 1 is a network-oriented approach. Highly internationalized firms, not using automation, but relying on intra-corporate transfer. Pattern 2 is quite different because so these are not internationalized firms, and they do automation. And pattern 3, we see something else happening. We see partnering for migration factoring in addition to both being internationalized and using automation, which is interesting because it barely happens. But when it does happen, it is associated with a positive outcome. Only 16% of our firms, of our MNEs, do this, but when they do it, it does work quite a lot. You can even see in terms of how these solutions are filled, how many cases are we talking about? This is the biggest solution, but it happens the least. So there are quite some interesting policy ramifications for that as well. So I'll hand back to Isaac.
You've done an excellent job in actually discussing it in layman's words. Maybe I don't even need to go over this, but for those who might have been still lost with all these circles of filth and circles, this might be a neat way to just present it to those who are not familiar with all those symbols. You already mentioned some of the pathways. We gave them a really neat label, network driven. So the first one is capturing multinationals that have a wide international network. So that means they can use their subsidiaries as reservoirs of talent to move people around within the EU. They do not hire third country nationals, as you can see, for an effective way in which to recruit talent. So what is key there is EU's relatively free sort of mobility framework. You would say that's a key asset for them to fill skill shortages. The second pathway, as Daniel indicated, is basically encompassing multinationals with limited international networks, so they don't have the same kind of resources that the multinationals in the first pathway. How do they compensate for that? By relying on automation. And they combine that with sort of migration patterns or intra-corporate transfers within the EU to address certain skill shortages. They also do not rely on recruiting third country nationals. And finally, those that are really globally integrated, which you could see is a hybrid model, combine machine reliance or automation with proactive ways of partnering with institutions for migration, as well as less significantly, more peripherally, also use third country nationals and remote work contracts. What I want to say next is, in my final slide, I beg your pardon. Oops. Yes, here we are. In conclusion, you can say there are varied or heterogeneous ways in which multinationals are addressing the talent shortages, and that is, at least in the context of this analysis, driven by their level of internationalization. But we had, in a previous presentation, our dear colleague Friedrich make a really relevant comment, which was about what does it mean that these companies are facing severe shortages? Could that have a key significant role? And we have taken that on board in our subsequent analysis, which we're going to reserve for a future presentation. And it does indeed play a role. So thank you very much for that comment. I'm not going to repeat what we have already just talked about, successful approaches. I do want to say, however, that if I go back one slide and ask you, just to wake you all up, because some of you might be falling asleep, what is common to these three pathways?
Integration, MyPix.
Yes, you're from the project consortium. I was hoping someone from Okay, never mind. Thank you very much, Jessica. That is indeed the case. I have not touched upon the yellow last column there. So in all of these pathways, we have a strong integration policy, and that's actually represented by firms in Germany. They score high on this. What does that tell you? So all these innovative approaches of plugging the talent gap is not going to be serving its purpose unless you have to operate in a strong institutional context. We have pointers for policymakers based on all these improvements that multinationals are seeking as support for what they themselves are busy with. And that will define the scope of their operations, of course, as what we have in the last point, and still incentivize them to get involved in skill partnerships, particularly beyond the EU, and also make it less cumbersome for them to obtain flexible work permits and recognize qualifications, going back to our dear colleague and many others. So I'll end it there and hand over to Theo.
So hello everyone. I'm from SEO. I'm happy to be here. And I'm going to talk about small and medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs, in a global framework. And the first question you may ask yourself is, why? Why are SMEs important in the economic framework? I mean, when you just walk through Geneva, which all of us did, you see a construction firm working on a building, maybe 50 employees, and that's it, only working in Geneva. And yet I'm here talking on an event for global strategy for skills. So why are SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises important? Well, first of all, as a group, they employ 73% of the entire European workforce. So second, they contribute more than 50% of EU's GDP. So while these firms in themselves are quite small, as a group, they are of great importance. And the idea is if you study something about the organs, you may learn something about the entire body. Second point, why SMEs might be important. If you think about, again, the construction firm in Geneva, do you think they face really different challenges than the construction firms in the Netherlands or in Estonia or Germany? Probably not. But you can always check this to ask them a question. Well, this is your firm. Which skills do you think is the most important or are the most important to be successful? And that's also what we did. So when we look, for instance, at the manufacturing sector, or the construction sector, I'm sorry, from all countries, Estonia, Germany, Netherlands, Switzerland, they indicate, well, physical non-routine skills we value as the most important. Of course, there are also some things they value differently. But across all sectors, so for instance, also the information and communication sector, they say, well, actually what matters the most for us is this skill. And also, again, not going to sugarcoat anything, you see differences. But there is some underlining that actually, although firms work in regional job markets, they are small, there is some common line underneath what they value most. And then the next question is, because of course it's already here, to address shortages, also SMEs face skill shortages. And then the question is, well, if you face skill shortages, how do you deal with this? And we basically have sort of two building blocks. And the first one focuses on, well, general things to deal with skill shortages. And the second one, that's a better name, is migration. So you can also see the first block as not migration. So if you don't think about migration, what can SMEs do to tackle skill shortages? Well, first thing is just focus on what you already have. So we call that internal capacity. So how well is your staff trained? What's your product and service quality so that people don't come back to you because the product is not good enough? Those kind of things. So if you take that in order, then maybe you can also address skill shortages. Second thing, we call it implementation challenges. Yeah, maybe it's not really skills, but if you just have a little bit more time, a little bit more money, we can do something and the problem is solved. And there's a third category, which may be a little bit confusing. That's the action of competitors, because on one hand, you may think, well, competitors may want to push you out of the market, and that makes it difficult to solve skill shortages. But on the other hand, you can also copy from competitors, and that makes it more easier to address skill shortages. So that's the three factors that can eliminate skill shortages. Focusing on the migration cornerstone, there are also three things that play a role. So the first thing is basically the institutional part, so legal and administrative. So is it easy to get your qualifications recognized? Is it easy to get your visa? And so on. Second component are residency rules. So once you are there, is it easy to switch jobs? Is it possible to only work the temporary or permanently? And the last one, focus on if the employer can do something themselves. So if you give a reference, is it easy to get the visa or not? And based on these 6 actions, you could say, we only need one more question to ask. And that question is, do you deem yourself successful in challenging skill shortages? And based on these ingredients, you can run a regression. This looks very difficult, but given that I'm the speaker, it's not difficult. So let me break it down for you. So the left-hand side of the regression basically says, well, if you deem yourself successful, then it can depend on the things we just mentioned, which is, if I have a mouse, this letter V. And then we control for some other things like the country, the sector, and some firm-specific effects. So if the company is very big or the company is very old, you might have some this or not. But let's focus on the V for a minute. So what does it mean? Let's say we focus on internal capacity. And you say, yeah, I'm very successful in doing this. Then you would expect a positive coefficient. But if you focus on internal capacity and you say, well, I cannot manage to do so, then you will expect a negative coefficient. So on the next slide, we're going to look at the coefficients and determine what is successful in tackling skill shortages. So we first focus on the general part. And I forgot to tell you, the stars indicate significance. And we find that internal capacity has a positive effect on tackling skill shortages. And when you break this down further to the components, they actually indicate that the skills of existing staff and the product service quality are the ones driving this significance. Well, actually, competitors is slightly negative at the 10% level. So apparently, competitors make it somewhat difficult to do skill shortages. For migration, we basically don't find anything significant at the 5% level or larger or smaller, I should say. But if employers do something with visa helping, then there is something going on that may be successful. Not that strong, but it is there. So we have these two components. Internal capacity helps. That's basically the main thing. And then there's one other question we asked in the survey. And that is, well, this is what you do, but if you can ask the government for help in addressing skill shortages, what do you actually want them to do? And we also ask this question across all 4 countries, of course. And then you get maybe not a that surprising image, but you see that number 1 across all countries is the strengthening of vocational education. And number 2 across almost all countries is the subsidies for training programs. And what ranks basically very at the bottom is the facilitation of immigration, or this national, European, or overseas training initiatives, although Estonia is a little bit of an outlier in this, but you still see there's a gap between vocational education and training programs and things that has to do with migration. Well, of course, you can interpret this in 2 ways. One way could be, well, if you have, for instance, like Germany or the Netherlands, I think also Switzerland have very good apprenticeships programs. Maybe that's just where you put your money on, and because you were successful, then why bother about doing all this migration things? Another way to look at this is, well, if migration is so difficult and you have something that works, I'm not going to do the migration path because it's just too much of a hassle. Now, then that's basically the end. But let's briefly summarize what we saw. The first thing that we saw is that MNEs are of great importance for the European economy. And then we talked about in terms of employment numbers. And even though we see that skills differ between sectors and also somewhat between countries, there is a sort of common denominator that across sectors, particular skills are valued the most. So the construction sector in Germany values the same skills. Firms in the construction sector in Germany value the same skills as the ones in Switzerland, the Netherlands, or Estonia. And then when you look at successful tackling skill shortages, we see that the skills of existing staff or product or service quality are the main channels and the internal capacity that solves them for these firms. And that may explain that they mainly focus on vocational education or subsidies for training programs when they look at the government for solutions, because that's very closely linked to what they use to tackle their skill shortages now. So that's all I have to say. I'm looking forward to your questions, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Albert. Thanks to all the analysts for this super exciting new insights and research, and also for making my job easier by pointing to the complementarity between your work. I know I was definitely struck by the continued thorny relationship between the private sector and public policies, between the public policies that are involved in this overall question for the for the conference, but I would like to open the floor to questions, maybe take a bunch at once. And also, yeah, thank you for keeping the time, everybody, because I know we have time for a little bit of discussion before our punctual break. All right, I'll start in the back.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Karim Ashur, University of Speldekamp. So I would keep my question discussion to what we have been discussing in the break is to B2B model. And I would like also to thank you so much for this paper because it came out, I think it changed the narrative about how we speak about SMPs and raises the question, we shall move from state-led initiative to private-led initiative when it comes to the SMPs. But I still have some question regarding to this. So it's still like a question as brainstorming is where the funding would come from, what extent that the migrant will be protected, especially when I'm talking about the model number 3. And I have seen a lot of abuses happening from the private companies, what we call them selling dreams and taking like, if they would recruit 100, only 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 would migrate, and then they would be able to market this. To what extent this would be covered the needs of, like, for example, the model number 1, joint ventures, would also, the SMEs would be able to do this. So it's some, to what extent this also take into consideration that the needs, the essence of the GSP model or SME model, the needs of the countries of origin and country destination. I don't still get into the details of the models, and I understand the restriction of the time, but I think from what you explained, model number 2 would be interesting. And I think IOM right now is doing something interesting regarding to this between Morocco and Belgium, where they need to have 2,000 people who migrate from Morocco, work as truck drivers in Italy. And according to the EU regulations and EU directives, they have to have the license from EU authority or EU body. What they are thinking right now is to have the OFPPC in Morocco, which is the Vocational Training Institute in Morocco, be licensed in Morocco to provide. So this could be also a model, not necessarily be a state model, but for instance, in Egypt, there is also like a Siemens, which is also a private one that can be certified and train people, and then they can also some stay, some also go out. It's possible also this could be private state partnership, also could be also CSR model intervene. So I think that's a question is for reflection of all the author and author. So thank you.
Thank you, Karim. And I think everybody's taking notes on the questions, right? So we'll take from Mati and Christian, and then we can do answers and then another round, maybe.
Thank you very much for all presentations. First, I need to read all the databases that you compiled from the CTAs. I would like to get a link to it because it's useful for future research. Also, the data on the surveys that you collected, they're all interesting. So I need to think about it. What was I liked SWOT analysis, Friedrich's, but there is something missing. Yeah, a large company. So first, I like the construction of panel that had also SMEs at the end. So for large firms that are facing shortages, if there are huge barriers for entrance of migrants, they become multinational. So they invest somewhere else. Yeah. So instead of having a joint venture to get migrants to the country, they would prefer to invest there and make their production facilities there, and they can benefit from that. Except if the production cannot be fragmented, it's a service sector that cannot go there. You know? So this needs to be also mentioned as an additional policy. Again, I mentioned in the meeting, and I had correspondence with Aisha before, it's better to rephrase MNEs and call it internationalized firms. Yeah. So that was it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, my question is very similar. Are these papers online already? Because I would really like to share them with my colleagues. And second, I wanted to make a remark about the findings presented by Albert on what SMEs want. In a different context, we have done some 10 years ago a study with the Migration Policy Institute on the integration of newcomers to your labor market integration of newcomers to European countries. And one of our findings was indeed also that you have much more impact when you use mainstream policies such as vocational training and integrate migrants into vocational training, which is available for every worker, rather than on targeted policies, which are, you know, sort of only targeted on migrants. And I think this would be then very much in line sort of with your findings. Thanks.
Yeah, so I don't know who wants to start with the answer. Maybe we could do left or right. Okay, for you, Friedrich.
Okay.
Come in to help you out.
Okay. I feel better.
In the race.
Yeah, Karim, thank you very much. You raised a lot of good questions. Can we have a call next week? So, no, seriously, like, yeah, very good points, and that I'd be happy to discuss more. I tried to give some brief responses, not necessarily answers. So, the migrant protection, yes, is a huge issue. What I found from the literature, at least, so we didn't look very much into the problems of intermediaries because they are well documented in a way, but the literature seems to say also you have far less problems in the context of high-skilled migration. So and there's a few papers on that also. So what can we learn from that context? And is it perhaps really concentrated in things like agriculture and so on, where the structures are just different? The joint ventures by SMEs, yes, I also find it hard to imagine that for SMEs because it involves some paperwork and so on, involves cross-border business contacts, and exporting firms would often be the larger firms to begin with, and so that's why that's partly why we have also the setting with intermediaries in the paper, because for many SMEs it would be perhaps the only way forward, because the other options are not realistic for them. At the same time, I mentioned there could be sort of consortia of SMEs that sort of trust each other because they know each other from the region or something like that. And then together they act a bit like a larger firm. So that could work. A brief word on funding. Who funds this? Well, okay, some large companies, again, that have staff shortages, they have money also to fix this problem. But what I find perhaps more interesting is that ideally there's a problem to be solved here, and we've heard entrepreneurs love to solve problems. So I would hope for entrepreneurs to step in and set up training centers and companies that then cooperate with European companies to run this to run a scheme like this. So there's a lot of room for entrepreneurship, and it would make money because it fixes a need that is costly, right? Although having said that, if we link it back to the scandals of intermediaries, one way to avoid these scandals is to say you have to have a good standing as an intermediary or as a service provider. Good standing comes only after a few years. It sort of rules out entrepreneurship almost. So that's just a disclaimer that it's not as easy as it sounds. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
These questions.
Oh, Marty's question. Yes. What about offshoring? Well, it's the first time it's suggested actually in this context. I'm not, it wasn't obvious to us to take it into the paper. Perhaps you can say, yeah.
I think that maybe it's a relevant question, but if you're looking at multinationals as purely economic actors, yes, they would choose to invest somewhere else probably. But I've also had so many cases, although it's not the focus of our survey or your paper necessarily, those are trying to balance their economic goals with a social mission as well. In the long term, if they have that long-term perspective, to also make money out of those social projects. So I wouldn't necessarily say that they would be looking elsewhere to take their operations to. Maybe that counter presents a counter argument. And that social mission is on the rise as well, as more pervasive than the traditional understanding of what large organizations tend to do, as long as they have the international networks. Can I point also on the other point you raised? Yes, we've taken that seriously as well. That's multinationals, as we defined it, is more of a loose definition, because they may have a sales or marketing operations abroad, not necessarily a physical asset, manufacturing operation or an R&D facility. So we took a subsample, and I can tell you more about that, to see what would happen. Would we have different patterns? And you recall the findings?
Yeah, well, so for those of you not in the consortium, it's good to know we also have a lot of meetings within the consortium. We recently had one on this very issue where Madi indeed raised, look, are these really multinationals or are they just international? And this is a very good point. And indeed, we are taking that seriously. We just didn't have the time to also change the presentation. So keep in mind, we have like Isa said, a loose definition. We checked this and many other things. And I think the results are by and far the same. So we don't see big differences, but the method that we use is quite sensitive to, because it detects patterns. It's not necessarily a regression technique where you get more generic insights. Really dig into the data, explore it. These are the patterns that exist. So there are some differences, none that I really recall. I don't think they attacked our main points though. So in general, we see these networked within the EU moving, moving people around via intercorporate transfer. We see an alternative doing that also non-EU automating, and indeed we see those patterns, they still hold. In terms of what I also found was an interesting question, both from Madi and Christiane. Thank you for that. The papers will come. We are going to share it, and the data sets that we have, and also that Albert used and SEO used, and for which I should also thank our Swiss partners, which I didn't do yet, so sorry about that. But we are going to share that as well, so that will be open, and
only after the working papers have been drafted. That's an
Exactly.
agreement we reached.
I have informed the online participants also on that question. So.
Yeah, we have to do that because otherwise people are understandably, and we want them to run away with our data, just not before we have done what we want to do.
Sorry to disappoint you, Matty.
Yeah. So it will come, and we will disseminate broadly, and I will make sure that I also email both of you and that you have it. So yeah, thank you very much. Oh, I know Albert also had a question from you, Christiane.
No, it was only a remark actually, but
Oh, okay.
please go ahead.
Well, if it's a remark directly following up.
No, it was on the study you did or colleagues of you did, and it's just very nice to see that it's well aligned, and it also shows maybe a different way to integrate immigrant workers into SMEs. And that it may not have to be an overseas training initiative, but it can also be that if you enroll them into vocational education, that's a more effective route. Yeah.
And I have a follow-up question to Friedrich. The story about the consortia of SMEs, did you conceive this as, for instance, chambers of industry, commerce, or crafts getting together across borders? And just sort of regional ones, not national ones, regional ones? Because
So,
that also exists.
Sure, that could be. What then comes into play also is the competition among the members, right?
Yes.
So, but if you're regional employers, so recently I was working in Bolzano, and they're like, yeah, like you're in the mountains, sort of the others who also live next to you in the mountains. Even though they are not in your line of business. So in that context, for example, you could get together and set something up, and there's no competition because you're all doing different things in a way.
And then I know we have some online questions, but Sandra and Lisa, did you have anything you wanted to say before? I guess about your findings being available as well, right?
I think it's great to see the connections between what we find in the survey, right? That multinational companies do use intra-corporate transfer also as a strategy to fill shortages. And on the other hand, what Friedrich was saying, that multinational companies can be a partner in such a transnational partnership to develop skills in a subsidiary that circulate within the different countries where the company is active, and that there's a connection between what we find in the economic world, in the world of these companies with the regulatory framework, and we have studied it in these international trade agreements. So, that's something that is not well known yet, but that really has developed, and we should maybe also try to find whether they are thinking about this intra-company transfer as a way to, as a sort of talent partnership.
What about data? Your data is available?
Part of it is, I can give you afterwards, and part of it is. Yeah.
And then I know we had some online questions, and Elizabeth as well.
Yeah, so this is quite a specific question about the distinction between attracting and retaining migrant workers. So if this information is available in the data, and if so, if there can be a distinction between approaches and challenges when it comes to retaining and attracting.
We'll take that one, and then Elizabeth, did you have something?
Just really to start by thanking the entire panel. It's actually really hard to bring it down to one question because I have questions for all of you, but I hope I can follow up. So maybe a question really to both Albert and to Friedrich. So Albert, when you talk about the SME prioritization in terms of the strategies they want to take, I appreciate funding didn't come into this, but do you think funding might have implications in terms of the way that SMEs versus multinationals react in terms of the strategies they take? And then Friedrich, thank you so much for outlining all those different options for new global skills partnerships. What is next in terms of research in this area, and why? Thank you.
So retention and funding. We can go backwards. You want to answer it, Elizabeth, right away, and then we'll talk about migrant retention. Or?
Yeah, I can start with funding as well. So yes, of course, funding may have an effect, right? Because it's still, you subsidize something to react to this. On the other hand, it would also, of course, affect on how, because we talk about SMEs, right? So it's in our definition up to 250 employees. So they are not, if you have 50 employees and you get funding, you're not going to hire 50 migrants because that's simply too big. So even if you have a growth path, then the question will still be, well, if you're very happy with your apprenticeship model at the vocational education, basically, then it may not be the outcome you want by simply giving subsidies to hire migrants. So in that sense, funding, yes, it will have an effect, but given that you work with small firms, you shouldn't expect large shifts in policies because it just needs, if you want to shift big, you only need to be bigger most of the time. Yeah.
And then no other comments on the online question is to make your attention.
We don't have questions distinguishing recruitment versus retainment. Unfortunately, we were really limited to a 15-minute survey. Otherwise, we had to incur higher costs. That's the practicality of dealing with survey companies.
They already had 26 questions or something, or 24. So you run into the limits of what the respondents are willing to give you, unless you pay them. So.
Well, we have a couple more minutes, or we could. Yeah. Do we have any? Sorry, I'm missing hands.
There was a question I asked for Friedrich.
I wasn't sure if you were okay.
Quick comment on attracting versus retention. I can only sort of salute the question because retention, in my view, is totally understudied in a migration context and is a real problem. We have put a lot of effort into recruiting highly skilled migrants, and then after a few years, they're gone, and it was often avoidable. Incidentally, with Arjen, there is some work in a Dutch context that we did a few years ago. There's very, very little on that. On what is next, really what is next is feedback on this, and we're happy to have feedback from today, for example. Feedback from practitioners, also from business decision makers or those who were involved. A friend of mine was involved at an administrative level in such a thing at a hospital. I learned a lot from her. So basically to understand where the things that we are looking at here or that we are theorizing about are just sort of, they look good on paper, but they're not realistic, or this is not how businesses think like or so, or the sort of perhaps possibly also problems that we didn't see or opportunities that we didn't see. So the next step in that sense is not yet decided. It will hopefully grow out of feedback and more discussions after this first brainstorming exercise. Yeah.
Maybe just a response, not from this project, but 10 years ago, I've been working for the Dutch government on a study with microdata to look at highly skilled workers coming to the Netherlands, selecting kind of high income professions and looking at, following these individuals over time. And so issues of retention, but also of skilling have been studied in that. And an eye-opener was actually the high degree of de-skilling that happened. So even though you started in high salaries and high positions, there was a de-skilling happening and increased unemployment or people having left the country actually as well. So there are some insights available for the Netherlands. Yeah.
Sorry, do you explain the de-skilling by discrimination? Or how do you explain the de-skilling?
We don't go that far. It's an empirical analysis. It's studying what is happening actually, rather than. It's always easy to use a label of discrimination, of course, but what does that exactly entail, right?
I think I'm going to thank my colleagues again. Personally learned a lot from you in the past couple of years. Was that the standalone move to closing remarks?
Maybe Elisa and Tesseltje, we wrap up and close this workshop with a few words of thanks. I mean, maybe if I may start, for me, it has been wonderful to listen to you also in person. We have met a bit online, but more travels when discussing in person. And it's really, Tesseltje, congratulations, you put the great group together, because it's so complementary. We come from different angles, different disciplines, different folks. So people working on firms, on corporations, on companies, people working on the political frameworks, people on the legal framework, and that's so fruitful. So I think it really creates many synergies, and it's a joy to be in this consortium. And
Sentiments are likewise.
yeah, and still for 1.5 years. We're quite far.
We have data.
Data. I totally, I mean, listening to you guys, listening to this panel as well, I think this was, and I also feel it from the responses from the room. I think this was one of the more innovative parts of the consortium, bringing you guys together from these different disciplines. And that's, I think, the great joy, and this is, people look at me, but it's really teamwork with Pascal as well, where we put both our networks on the table and we start to see who we know and who does what and who we don't know, and we can reach out and find who's doing this to bring this consortium together. Already, I'm quite impressed and really happy with how good everybody is in timekeeping, not just in their talks right now, but in the delivering of the research that we need. So indeed, we have a year and some months to go. And I was listening to you guys and the questions that come up. I think whether it's a special issue or a book or something which we didn't foresee, but there's so much interesting intersections of the work that I think we should really think, and we have a consortium meeting after this meeting, so I think this will be one of the topics, is what comes next. How do we build on this and towards future research agendas? And when I say future, I tend to, there's 7 bad years and there's 7 good years. I think we're sort of in the middle of something bad. So let's try to think beyond. So we go to 2030 and on. So where do we want to go then with our global objectives, etc. And this panel has some very interesting ideas for that. So,
but one interesting point is that these new things are going on despite the political climate. So
true.
Even Hungary is doing things. So
yeah, Italy is doing great things, and you might think politically they're not, but then on the ground, a lot is very interesting that's happening. You can say a lot about the Netherlands not wanting more migration, yet the initiatives that Morocco is taking, for instance, on this driver license activity, I think that's the kind of thinking that is ongoing. How can we work together on training so that the people have the qualifications that we need in the future without all the administrative song and dance standing in. So there's a lot to take from what's happening. Yeah,
and I think I would like to also mention the previous panel with Bettina and Yvonne highlighting these grassroots initiatives as well. I mean, this is so important, and maybe it's small scale, but there's the Global Compact on Migration, which also foresees the UN framework, which foresees such partnerships also in the private sector. And if there could be, a network that connects these grassroots initiatives, it could really build up to something more visible that then has a ripple off effect, and other companies learning from it and engaging more with it. Maybe it can even be part of sustainable development reporting. Why not? I mean, the companies do all these reports, and in the SDGs there is a target for fair migration and so on. I mean, it's a long title, I don't remember, but there is such an objective, and it can be part of this reporting, and then it becomes, something firms can sell also. So, yeah.
that's where we're going.
I like that. I mean, we try to push that, but it's very on a different level sometimes, like that we really get into the report. But we try it, that we are really on a company level strategically, we are a partner, and not just we do something good for once.
Maybe IOM can invite them to, one of these forums where the reporting on the progress.
Maybe just to mention, we have a new envoy for the IMRF, the International Migration Forum, for this year. So there are going to be internal discussions over the next few weeks about direction, and certainly from my own side, there is an interest in creating much more high impact initiatives. So I can take that point back. It doesn't rest with me per se.
We know where to find it. And this also goes for the people online. I think we should thank you very much for joining as well. Or those watching the presentations at a later stage, to reach out, to engage us with whatever conversations are ongoing or ideas that you have to push this further. I think we're a group of rather entrepreneurial researchers
always open for continuing the work and the thinking of how to engage with what is needed on the ground. Shall we, is that sort of a closing? Yeah? We switch off the recording, and I'd love to have a group picture. Yes, yeah, but you're an important, no, wait, oh. Leave on the slide. Slide. But we could also do the banner.